It was one of those quiet evenings where the world outside feels muted, like it's holding its breath for something you can't quite name. And I remember sitting in my car, parked under a dim street lamp that flickered like it, too, wasn't sure if it wanted to stay or go, holding my phone in one hand, staring at the cold, single-word reply she had sent me hours ago. Okay. Not angry, not curious, not affectionate, just a casual dismissal, void of punctuation, emotion, or even basic attention, as if all the energy I had poured into the conversation, into her, into us, was now being returned with mechanical apathy. And for the first time in what felt like months, I didn't get upset or confused or disappointed. I got still in that silence, with the soft hum of the engine and the dim buzz of a world that didn't seem to care whether I stayed or left. I suddenly realized something terrifying. I couldn't recognize the man holding the phone. Where once there had been fire, now there was fatigue. Where there had been confidence, there was a quiet ache. And where there had once been purpose, now stood only a habit of reaching for a woman who no longer reached back. I thought of all the nights I stayed up wondering what I did wrong, all the mornings I sent the first message hoping to reignite a connection that had long since faded, all the times I rearranged my schedule, my priorities, even my values, just to feel chosen. Just to feel seen. And it wasn't as if she had asked me to do those things. No, she didn't need to. Because like so many men who have been conditioned to equate love with effort and effort with worthiness, I had volunteered myself into invisibility, thinking that one more thoughtful message, one more check-in, one more act of loyalty would finally turn the tide. Finally awaken something in her that told her I was the one. But the truth is, the more I gave, the less I was worth. Not because I lacked value, but because I handed it over so freely, so predictably, that it lost its weight, its mystery, its tension. And that's when the question came to me, not in a shout, not in a burst of anger, but in a whisper from somewhere deeper than words. What happens when a man finally says enough? Not because he hates her, not because he wants to punish her, but because something inside of him has finally awakened to a sobering reality, that the cost of being available to someone who no longer sees you is the gradual erasure of your soul. That night in the car, I didn't cry. I didn't scream, or send some desperate message, or call a friend to dissect her silence. I just sat there, letting the quiet settle over me like a cloak, realizing that I had reached the end of something invisible, but no less real. The chase. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about whether she still cared. It was about the fact that I had made her the sun, and I the orbiting planet, always circling, always showing up, always lighting her world. While my own surface cracked from neglect, I had given everything to be chosen by someone who had stopped choosing. And in doing so, I had abandoned the one person I could never afford to lose, myself. You don't notice it happening. Not at first. It's not one grand betrayal or one explosive fight. It's a series of small, quiet compromises where you trade pieces of your dignity in exchange for breadcrumbs of validation, until one day you're standing in a relationship you barely recognize, with a woman who barely sees you, wondering how a man like you ended up begging silently or otherwise for attention that should have been mutual. That night, I turned off my phone, not to make a point, not to start a game, but because I needed, more than anything, to hear my own thoughts without her voice echoing inside them. Needed to remember the sound of my own certainty, the one that existed before the second guessing, the overanalyzing, the waiting, the proving, the endless dance of trying to earn what should have flowed freely. And as the minutes passed and the notification stayed silent, I began to feel something unexpected. Not panic, not withdrawal, but relief. Because the moment I chose not to chase was the moment I stepped out of the cage I had built with my own hands. You see, every man has a line. Some draw it early and walk away before the damage sets in. Others, like me, need to be brought to the edge, to that quiet, flickering place where the pain of holding on finally outweighs the fear of letting go. And that's when the shift begins. Not in her, not in the messages she may or may not send, but in you, in your spine, in your gaze, in the slow return of your power to the place it always belonged. I didn't know at the time what that silence would cost. I didn't know if she would notice, if she would care, if she would reach. But I knew this. I was done reaching where I was not met. I was done investing in a connection that only existed when I kept it alive. And most importantly, I was done abandoning the man I had once been proud to be. That's the breaking point. Not some fiery outburst or final confrontation, but the stillness of a man reclaiming himself, piece by quiet piece. And if you've found yourself here, if you felt the exhaustion of one-sided effort, if you've ever sat in your car, or on your bed, or in your own thoughts wondering how something that once felt so alive could leave you feeling so invisible, then I'm speaking to you, brother, because this journey I'm about to share isn't just my story. It's our story. The story of every man who chose peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and self-worth over chasing someone who mistook presence for weakness. So if any part of this resonates, I invite you to keep going with me. This isn't about her anymore. It's about the man I became after I walked away, and the man you can become. 2. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men to follow this journey, because in the next chapter, I'll show you exactly what changed when I stopped chasing and started leading. In the days that followed my decision to stop chasing her, something strange began to happen. Not in her world, at least not right away, but in mine. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I woke up without checking my phone for her reply. There were no morning texts sent out of obligation, no compulsive scrolling through her social media to decode passive-aggressive updates, no imaginary conversations in my head trying to predict her next mood swing or decipher the meaning behind a delayed response. Instead, I poured black coffee, let the silence of the morning greet me without urgency, and returned to things I had long neglected. Not just the gym or the book stacked on my desk, but the person I used to be before I confused love with pursuit. And I need to be clear about this. I wasn't playing games. I wasn't withholding attention to manipulate her into missing me. I had simply stopped offering myself to someone who showed no intention of receiving me fully. It wasn't revenge. It was recovery. The first few days were still. She didn't notice, at least not in any visible way. No messages, no questions, no sudden confessions of clarity. But I had expected that, because the version of me she was used to, always reaching, always waiting, always filling the silence with effort, was no longer there. And so, she had nothing to react to. Only absence. Only space. But then something shifted. It started with a story. One of those vague, melancholy posts, a quote about distance or trust, or some people change, the kind of thing designed to feel universal but always aimed at someone specific. Then came the old photos repost from better days, of smiles and sunsets and moments we once shared, now filtered and repurposed like relics meant to haunt me. Next came the messages, not direct, not warm, but carefully casual. We haven't talked in a while. Hope you're okay. Miss. Seeing your name pop up. The irony, of course, is that she never acknowledged the absence I had created. She didn't say, "I miss you." She didn't say, "Why did you stop reaching out?" Instead, she tested the waters with ambiguity, hoping I'd break the silence first, hoping I was still that man who'd rush in at the slightest invitation, eager to fix what she wouldn't name as broken. But I didn't take the bait, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood the cost of caring without boundaries. For the first time in our dynamic, she was no longer steering the emotional wheel. And the difference was seismic. I realized that what had changed wasn't just our communication, it was the balance of power. Because when you stop chasing, when you stop over-explaining and over-investing and over-giving, you remove the illusion that your value comes from how much of yourself you sacrifice. And once that illusion is gone, once your attention becomes something earned rather than expected, something shifts in the woman who once held all the leverage. You become scarce. And in scarcity, value is born. You see, most women are not consciously manipulative, but they are, by nature, emotionally attuned and intuitively strategic. They can sense when a man's energy is orbiting them, whether he says it or not. And when that orbit breaks, when your gaze returns to your own life, your own vision, your own peace, something ancient awakens in her. It's not jealousy. It's not even regret. It's fear. Not fear of you moving on, but fear of losing the psychological control she never admitted to needing in the first place. And here's where my perspective changed completely. Because up until that point, I thought the opposite of chasing was detachment. That to stop pursuing meant to stop feeling, to stop caring, to become some stoic shell of a man who simply doesn't give a damn. But I learned that wasn't true. What changed wasn't my capacity to love. It was my capacity to love without abandoning myself. And when that shift took root, everything around me recalibrated. Suddenly, she became the one wondering. She became the one revisiting old memories, rereading old messages, scanning old photos for the man she had once taken for granted, now gone. But I wasn't gone. I was just elsewhere. I was in the gym, rebuilding the discipline I once outsourced to her approval. I was in books, studying ideas that made me feel sharp and capable again. I was walking alone in nature, no music, no text, just silence and breath, and the strange comfort of becoming enough for myself again. And with every day that passed without reaching back, my clarity grew stronger. I began to see how much of myself I had given without being asked. How often I had explained myself without being heard. How long I had stayed loyal to a woman who was loyal only to her own convenience. And in that mirror of self-reflection, I saw not a victim, but a man who had finally reclaimed the reins of his own life. So when she finally did reach out, not with ambiguity, but with intent, when she asked if we could talk, if we could clear the air, if maybe we rushed away too quickly, I didn't rush toward her voice. I stood still, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed to know, without illusion or hope or fantasy, if she was coming toward me because she missed me, or because she missed the power she once had over me. That's the difference. That's the moment. The game ends when your attention is no longer on trial, when your love is no longer a leash, when your silence speaks louder than all the messages you once sent at midnight, hoping she'd finally understand your worth. And if you're reading this now, wondering if the silence is worth it, if the withdrawal will make any difference, I want you to understand something that took me years to learn. The absence of your presence will always be louder than the noise of your desperation. You don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to beg for clarity. You just need to return to yourself fully, honestly, unapologetically. Because when you change, the dynamic changes. When you stop chasing, she starts remembering. And when you start choosing yourself, you give her the rarest experience a modern man can offer, the realization that your love is not free. It's not predictable, and it's not a guarantee. She must earn it. Just like you've earned this moment, this awareness, this strength, this return. If this shift in mindset resonates with you, if you've felt the pull to stop chasing and finally reclaim your center, then you're not alone. Join the men who've made that same decision. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men and stay with me, because in the next part of this story, I'll show you exactly how she responded and how I stayed composed when everything in her world began to unravel. It began with a message simple, disarming, and carefully neutral. Hey, you okay? No context, no urgency. Just a polite nudge disguised as concern, as if she were gently knocking on a door she once had the key to, unsure if anyone still lived behind it. And I knew in that instant it wasn't just a check-in. It was reconnaissance, because women, whether they admit it or not, can feel when the current shifts, when the energy they once fed on no longer arrives at its usual time with its usual softness. And when that current goes silent, they don't panic immediately, but they start scanning for signs. That first message I left unanswered, not out of spite, not to hurt her, and certainly not because I had stopped caring, but because I had nothing left to say that wouldn't undo the quiet I had finally earned. And sure enough, a day or two later, another message followed. Busy lately? The kind of sentence you throw into a void when you're hoping someone still feels obligated to explain themselves. I didn't, because the man she had grown used to, the one who would reply instantly, who would use any excuse to re-engage, who would see even the smallest opening as an invitation to chase, again no longer existed. What she was engaging with now wasn't confusion. It was stillness. And stillness to someone who's used to controlling the rhythm is terrifying. Then came the more emotional threads. We used to talk more. I miss how things were. I don't know what happened to us. But even in those messages, there was no accountability, no self-reflection, only a subtle attempt to pull me back into the familiar dance, where my guilt was the music and her detachment was the choreography. Yet I didn't move. I didn't bite. I didn't explain myself or apologize for my absence or offer reassurance. To a woman who had once watched me pour myself dry without ever reaching out to refill the cup. Instead, I stayed still. Deliberately, quietly, powerfully, because I had finally learned the lesson. No one teaches young men about relationships. That not every silence needs to be broken. That sometimes silence is the answer. And that when you stop speaking just to soothe her discomfort, you force her to sit with the echo of your absence. And that echo often says far more than any well-worded text ever could. Of course, the silence didn't go unnoticed. And when the emotional messages didn't work, the performances began. I saw it first in her stories, suddenly more curated, suddenly more revealing. Photos in flattering lighting. Poses that hinted more than they revealed. Captions that screamed independence with just enough sadness to feel human. Then came the quotes. You know the kind. The ones about outgrowing people, about walking away from those who don't value you, about learning to love yourself again. Irony, it seems, has a flair for drama. And then perhaps most predictably came the photos with other men. Some subtle, some not. A drink clinked across a table. A blurry figure behind her shoulder. A laughing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but none of it landed. Not because I didn't notice, but because I saw through it. I understood what those images were trying to trigger. Jealousy, doubt, insecurity. I was supposed to wonder, to flinch, to reach out, but I didn't. Because by then, I had realized something I had never seen clearly before, that every silence I held became a mirror she couldn't avoid. That for every word I didn't send, a question bloomed in her mind. And the man who had once seemed so available, so predictable, so safe was now something far more dangerous, unreachable. I had, without effort, become the unknown. And women don't fear losing what they control. They fear losing what they never finished understanding. That's the paradox no one talks about. She wanted my loyalty, but she was addicted to my availability. And when the availability vanished, her comfort crumbled. But here's the most important thing I can share with any man who finds himself at this crossroad. Holding your ground will test you in ways you didn't expect. Because silence is not easy. Stillness is not passive. Every part of you will want to respond, to clarify, to soothe, to explain that you're not angry, just done. But don't shatter your own peace to satisfy her curiosity. Don't climb back into a cage you just learn to unlock. Because if she truly values what you bring, if your presence meant more than convenience, she have to meet you in the stillness. She have to lean in instead of pulling away. She have to earn back the access she once assumed was permanent. And if she doesn't, then your silence just did the one thing your voice never could. It revealed the truth. You see, when I stopped needing her, she began to need me. Not because I became colder, not because I became cruel, but because I became rare. And rarity, in a world full of men who chase, explain, overshare, and self-sacrifice, is the most irresistible quality of all. She began to remember not just who I was, but how I made her feel. Not through effort or performance, but through presence. She remembered the steadiness, the way I listened, the way I gave without demand. And she felt the void when all of that stopped showing up on command. But by the time she reached that realization, I had already crossed into a new chapter, one where her emotions were no longer my responsibility. One where my silence wasn't punishment, but protection. One where I no longer flinched at the sound of her name. I had, through stillness, recentered my life around something stronger than validation. I had returned to the man who didn't chase, but led, who didn't beg but chose, Who didn't react but understood? And in that space, something even deeper began to grow. Something I hadn't expected. Something I want to share with you in the next part of this journey. If you're finding yourself somewhere in these words, if you've felt the pull to explain, to fix, to break the silence just so you can be seen again, I want you to pause. Not forever. Just long enough to ask yourself this. What if your stillness is the only thing that will finally make her see you? Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, because in the next chapter, I'll tell you exactly what happened when she started chasing, and how I kept my ground without ever needing to run again. It didn't come with fireworks or some grand, cinematic moment, no teary phone call in the middle of the night, no apology typed out in trembling hands, no dramatic realization that everything she needed had been standing in front of her the entire time. It was just a message, simple, quiet, but loaded. I miss you. And for a brief moment, I felt that familiar pull, the part of me that used to wait for those words like a starving man waits for bread. The part of me that still remembered what it was like to feel wanted by the one who had stopped choosing me, but I didn't respond the way I used to. I didn't rush to reassure her, didn't fumble for the right words to keep the door open, didn't read it 3 times trying to decode its sincerity. I just sat with it. I breathed. I let the silence stretch. And in that pause, I realized how far I had come. Because months ago, those 3 words would have been enough to resurrect every broken piece of me, to convince me that she'd changed, that she finally saw me, that everything I had poured into her had been worth it. But now I heard them for what they were, not a revelation, but a reaction. You see, when a woman says, "I miss you," after you've finally stepped away, it's not always about regret. Sometimes it's about discomfort. Discomfort with the quiet. Discomfort with losing control. Discomfort with seeing the man she once directed like a puppet begin to walk without strings. And that's exactly what had happened. I had stopped dancing, and she had started wondering. The days that followed that message weren't filled with apologies. They were filled with performance. Suddenly, her social media changed. No more vague sadness or quotes about heartbreak. Now it was sun-lit photos, hair done just right, outfits carefully selected not for comfort, but for effect. And it wasn't just visual. She started texting more frequently, sometimes asking how I was, other times just sending photos of things that reminded her of us, sometimes pretending to need my advice on something trivial, just to start a thread of conversation. She could stretch into relevance. She asked what I was reading, what I was listening to, if I had seen that new movie she once mentioned in passing, but never seemed interested in watching before. And slowly, she began to reposition herself, not as the distant, distracted woman I had once chased, but as the curious, attentive version of herself that had only appeared briefly in the beginning. Back when I was still a mystery, and she still felt lucky. She made plans. She picked the restaurants I liked, offered to drive, even suggested we keep things easy, with no pressure, no expectations, just 2 people who still cared enough to see what remained. But here's the truth. I didn't feel flattered. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had finally won. I felt clear. Clear enough to see the patterns, the intention, and the unspoken motivation that wove its way through every well-curated gesture. Because while she had changed her approach, I knew the question wasn't whether she missed me. It was whether she missed me, or just the version of herself that existed when I was still orbiting her world. And that question, once it takes hold in a man's mind, is not easily silenced. You begin to see the details you used to overlook. The way her compliments come with subtle tests. The way her checking in often leads to references of the past, strategically chosen to tug at your memory. The way her presence, though warmer now, still carries the scent of control, not in obvious ways, but in timing, tone, and the underlying need to know whether she still holds the power. But I had changed. And because I had changed, the dynamic could never return to what it was. I was no longer the man who chased her validation like oxygen. I no longer saw her effort as a prize, I saw it as data. And I began to ask myself the questions I never had the courage to face when I was still chasing. Was she trying to rebuild something real, or was she simply uncomfortable with being replaced? Did she miss who I was, or did she miss how she felt when I made her the center of my universe? Was her effort driven by insight, or by ego? And perhaps most sobering of all, if I let her back in, would I be stepping forward into something healthy, or stepping back into the very cycle I had just broken? The old me would have taken any sign of affection as proof of love. The man I had become knew better. Love isn't proved through convenience. It's revealed through consistency, clarity, and character over time. So no, I didn't say I miss you too. I didn't rush to meet her halfway. Instead, I watched, I listened, and I let time speak louder than words, because a woman can say anything when she feels the absence. But only time will show you whether that absence taught her to see your value, or merely reminded her that she no longer controlled it. And I had no interest in being reclaimed, only in being respected. So, if you've ever found yourself in that moment where the person who once overlooked you starts showing up again, acting brand new, wrapping affection in aesthetics and intention in sweetness, urge you to slow down. Don't let the thrill of being wanted cloud the wisdom you fought so hard to earn. Don't mistake her return for redemption. Sometimes a woman comes back not because she sees your soul, but because she misses the version of herself that felt adored by a man who no longer exists. If you're walking this same path, if you've felt her return, her softness, her sudden effort, then join me in the next part of this journey, because what matters next is not what she does, it's how you respond. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men and stay grounded, because in the next chapter, I'll show you exactly how I faced the final test, not whether she came back, but whether she deserved to stay. I didn't say yes. Not when she asked to meet. Not when she started calling more frequently. Not even when she sent the long message, heartfelt, apologetic, filled with memories and regret, saying she wanted to try again. Because even though a part of me was tempted to believe her, to trust that her return was rooted in clarity and not confusion, I knew better than to answer quickly. I had learned the hard way that the most dangerous decisions are often made when emotion clouds discernment. And so I gave myself time, not out of cruelty, not to punish her, but to observe what was real, to listen to something I had ignored for far too long, the quiet voice of my own intuition. I started asking the kind of questions that a younger version of me would have been too hopeful to consider. Not, does she miss me? Not, is she saying all the right things? But deeper ones. Does she uplift me or exhaust me? Does she love who I truly am, or just the way I once made her feel? And the answers didn't come quickly. They came in moments I let myself remember honestly, without nostalgia or blame. I remembered the many nights I waited for her to show up, emotionally or physically, and how many times I had to make excuses on her behalf, just to justify staying. I remembered how my needs slowly shrank, how I became smaller in order to make room for her moods, her timing, her chaos. I remembered that version of myself, the one who bent, who explained, who adjusted his value depending on how she was feeling that day. And I asked the most difficult question of all: if I let her back in, would I become him again? There was a night, I remember it vividly, when I sat alone on my balcony, city lights in the distance, the hum of silence wrapping around me like an old friend. The breeze was soft, the world quiet, and for the first time in weeks, there were no distractions. Just me, the night, and the truth. I closed my eyes and imagined what it would be like to say yes, to welcome her back, to pick up where we left off and pretend that this time would be different. And for a moment, the idea felt warm, familiar, comforting. But then I looked closer. I saw the slow erosion beginning again, the subtle way I'd start explaining myself, making room for her inconsistencies, softening my standards so that love could feel easy again. I saw myself monitoring her tone, interpreting her silences, hoping once more to be enough for a woman who had needed distance to see my worth. And suddenly, that warm idea turned cold, because the truth hit me, clearer than it ever had before. If I had to shrink to keep her, it was never love to begin with. I opened my eyes, and in that quiet moment, I made a decision, not from pain, not from pride, but from presence. I chose not to go back, not because I hated her, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally knew what my peace was worth. I had spent so long trying to earn love by becoming less of myself that I forgot that the right person will never require you to dim your light in order to stand beside them. And once I understood that, once I truly felt it in my bones, there was no going back. So when she asked again, when she said she was ready, when she promised that things would be different, I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't try to make her see what she had done. I simply said, I'm not him anymore. Not the man who waited. Not the man who tried to fix what didn't want to be held. Not the man who mistook effort for connection or sacrifice for strength. Told her with kindness and conviction that I wished her well, that I appreciated her words, but I had outgrown the version of myself who would have needed to hear them. And that's the part most people don't talk about, that true healing doesn't always end with a happy reunion. Sometimes it ends with a quiet goodbye that finally honors your own worth, because just as important as knowing when to fight for someone is knowing when to stop fighting for what you no longer need. The final test wasn't about her. It was about me. About whether I would trade the man I had become for the comfort of a connection that once made me feel needed, even when it never made me feel seen. And once I passed that test, once I chose myself with no drama, number debate, no need to be understood, something incredible happened. The ache stopped, not because I didn't care, but because I was no longer clinging to the illusion that being chosen by her would finally make me enough. I already was. And that kind of inner knowing doesn't scream. It doesn't prove. It doesn't chase. It just walks forward, quiet, steady, and free. If you've ever stood in front of someone who suddenly wants you back, if you've felt the pressure to say yes just because it feels good to be wanted again, I ask you to pause, not to reject them, not to run, but to ask the questions that matter. Do they see you? Or just their own reflection in your attention? Do they love you? Or just miss being loved by someone who made them feel whole? And if they stayed, would you still feel like yourself? If those questions resonate, you're already on the path. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, we'll explore what true power feels like when it's no longer tied to how someone else responds, but rooted in the one thing they can never take away: your ability to stand alone and still be whole. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, because what comes next isn't about love or loss. It's about rising into the kind of man who no longer negotiates his peace. After I chose not to return to her, after I passed the final test that so many men fail, not because they are weak, but because they haven't yet learned how to choose peace over pattern, something inside me began to shift. Not in a loud, triumphant way, but in the kind of quiet that only comes when you stop surviving and start living from the core of who you are. I didn't post about it. I didn't call my friends and say, "I've changed." I just woke up the next day, and instead of reaching for my phone to check for her name, I reached for my shoes and went to the gym. That first morning was nothing special. I didn't lift heavier. I didn't break records. I didn't walk out transformed. But I showed up for myself, not for a woman, not for revenge, not to build some fantasy version of who she might chase again. And that, in itself, was a revolution. Every morning after that, I returned. Not because I had something to prove, but because I was remembering how good it felt to move through life with discipline again, to sweat for no one's approval, to rebuild strength in my body as a reflection of the strength I was cultivating in my mind. From there, I started learning about money, not because I wanted to flash it, not to upgrade my wardrobe or take pictures in rented cars, but because I was tired of feeling like I needed someone else to rescue me from my future. I read books on investing, followed people who spoke about wealth without arrogance, and started seeing my finances not as a point of pride or pressure, but as a form of self-respect. Bit by bit, I reclaimed my time. I cut ties with people who only knew how to speak in gossip, in comparison, in competition. And in their place, I opened the door to new friendships, men and women who didn't drain me, who didn't make me feel like I had to entertain them or shrink myself to be accepted. People who met me with clarity and ease. And maybe that was the most surprising shift of all. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't need me to explain who I was becoming. They just watched me become. Was in that space without noise, without proving, without performance, that I finally began to taste what freedom really feels like. Waking up each day and living by your own rhythm, grounded in your values, responsible for your direction, unbothered by the shifting tides of other people's moods or judgments. I remember one particular night late, after a long day, muscles sore, emails unanswered, the world quiet. I walked past the mirror, paused, and looked at myself. Not to judge, not to criticize, but just to see. And for the first time in years, I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my gaze. I didn't think about who might or might not want me. I didn't see a man who had been left. I saw a man who had learned how to stay. And I said out loud, almost without thinking, "Now, I respect the man I see." Not because he was perfect, not because he had figured everything out, but because he had finally stopped trading his peace for proximity. That's the thing no one tells you about becoming the kind of man who walks the Stoic path. You don't become cold. You become calm. You don't become detached from life. You become rooted in what truly matters. And what matters, what always has and always will, is not whether she sees your value, or whether the world applauds your effort, or whether you ever get the apology you deserve. What matters is whether you live in such a way that you no longer need any of that. Because Stoic power isn't about controlling others. It's not about winning arguments or getting the last word. It's not even about walking away. It's about standing still, firm, centered, unmoved, while the world pulls at you with noise, expectation, and temptation. It's about choosing your response, not reacting to theirs. It's about looking at life and women and yourself and saying, I no longer chase anything that costs me my peace. And when you get there, when you truly embody that state, you realize that what once seemed like loss was actually initiation. That every moment she pulled away, every silence she offered, every dismissal she gave, was simply an invitation for you to rise, not into anger, not into ego, but into ownership. That's Stoic power. Not loud, not flashy, just undeniable. So, no, I don't miss her anymore, but I thank her, not because she loved me well, but because she left me empty enough to go looking for something deeper. And what I found wasn't another woman. It was a version of myself that didn't just demand respect. He lived like he already had it. If this is the path you're walking, if you've begun to feel that shift in your chest, that quiet voice telling you there's more than chasing, more than performing, more than proving, then I promise you this, you're not alone. What's waiting for you on the other side of that? Silence isn't loneliness. It's dignity. It's peace. It's power. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men if this message resonates, because in the next chapter, we'll talk about what it truly means to live without needing to be seen, and how that becomes the very thing that makes people unable to look away. There was a time in my life when love meant surrender, not the beautiful kind of surrender, where two people meet with open hearts and shared truth, but the silent kind, the kind where one person bends a little too far, gives a little too much, and disappears a little more with each compromise they make to be accepted. That person was me. I loved with the urgency of someone trying to prove he was enough. I gave with the desperation of a man who believed that affection had to be earned through sacrifice. And slowly, without ever saying it aloud, I began to disappear inside the very thing I thought would complete me. I told myself it was devotion, but it was dependency. I confused connection with captivity. I mistook closeness for clarity. And I became so consumed with being wanted that I stopped asking myself whether I was truly being seen. It wasn't until I let go, until I walked away from the version of love that cost me my center, that I understood what real love could feel like. It didn't have to be chaos. It didn't have to be performance. It didn't have to come at the expense of my identity. Because somewhere in the quiet after the storm, I discovered the power of detachment. And no, not the cold, disconnected version that some preach as a mask for fear. I'm talking about something deeper, something sacred. Detachment, I've come to learn, is not about refusing to love. It's about refusing to abandon yourself in the name of love. It's about showing up with a full heart, not an empty one waiting to be filled. It's about choosing someone, not needing them to complete you. When I finally understood that distinction, everything changed. I could now be close to someone without clinging. I could care deeply without needing control. I could offer presence without expectation. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of being left because I wasn't afraid of being alone. That's what detachment gave me, not indifference, but inner freedom. I could see a woman's beauty without mistaking it for my salvation. I could enjoy intimacy without making it the currency of my worth. I could offer loyalty, not from fear of losing her, but from the strength of knowing I would never again lose myself. It didn't happen overnight. There were days I still felt the pull, the old reflex to chase, to overgive, to fold myself into someone else's world so they'd never leave mine. But each time I paused, each time I breathed into the discomfort instead of reacting to it, I built something I never had before. Discipline of the heart. And discipline of the heart is a different kind of strength. It's not loud. It doesn't chase. It doesn't beg. It simply holds. It holds its own space, its own rhythm, its own truth. Even when love walks into the room and stirs the air. Now, when I love from choice, not compulsion. I love from overflow, not from need. And I no longer confuse possession with connection, because the kind of love I want, the only kind I'll allow into my life moving forward, is the kind that respects the boundaries of my spirit. The kind that doesn't require me to chase, but invites me to stand still and choose. And yes, I still feel. Yes, I still long. Yes, I still hope. But none of it owns me anymore. I can care without collapsing. I can stay present without losing perspective, and I can let someone walk away without crumbling into pieces, because detachment doesn't mean I stop showing up. It means I show up with clarity. It means I know where I end and where the other begins. It means I no longer apologize for choosing peace over proximity. It means I no longer fear losing someone who isn't ready to meet me in the place of mutual respect, effort, and presence. So when people ask me now if I'm afraid of falling again, I tell them no, because I don't fall anymore. I choose. And when you choose, when love becomes a conscious act rather than a desperate reaction, you stop handing out access to people who haven't earned the right to stand beside you. You stop letting chemistry override character. You stop accepting chaos because it feels familiar. You stop settling for almost when what you seek is sacred. That is what detachment gave me. Not distance, but dignity. Not apathy, but alignment. And if there's one truth I wish I could whisper into the ear of every man who's ever loved so hard he forgot who he was in the process, it would be this: you don't need to lose yourself to be loved. And if you do, it's not love. If this truth sits heavy in your chest, if you felt that quiet knowing that maybe, just maybe, you've been loving in a way that cost you too much, then you're not alone. You're not broken. You're just ready to love differently, to love better, to love from stillness instead of survival. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, because in the next chapter, I'll share what it means to carry this new way of loving into the world, not to prove anything, but to live with peace that no longer negotiates. I sit here tonight not as a man untouched by struggle or immune to heartbreak, but as someone who has walked through the fire of losing himself for love and emerged on the other side, not hardened, not closed off, but refined by the silence that follows when you no longer live your life hoping to be chosen by someone who was never truly looking in your direction to begin with. The words I write now are not meant to impress or convince, but to reach the quiet ache of the man who is. Reading this with tired eyes and a clenched jaw, wondering if there's something wrong with him for feeling invisible in a world that only notices men when they break or bleed. I write this because I remember what it felt like to exist in the background of someone else's spotlight, to give, and give until I no longer recognized my own reflection, and to mistake my disappearing act for devotion when, in truth, it was only desperation dressed as love. You see, there was a time when I believed that if I simply showed up enough, if I gave enough, if I proved myself thoroughly and consistently, then surely I would be seen, not just acknowledged, but truly seen in the way that makes a man feel real, rooted, and chosen. But what I've come to understand, what I hope you will come to understand too, is that love that requires the death of your identity is not love at all. It is a slow erasure, one that begins with small silences and ends with you apologizing for existing too loudly. I remember the nights when I would write long messages and delete them, the moments when I'd stare at the screen waiting for a reply that never came, and the hollow ache that followed every time I realized that I had once again mistaken effort for intimacy. And yet, despite the exhaustion, I stayed in those patterns because no one had ever told me that a man does not have to perform for connection, that he does not have to chase what is truly meant for him, and that real love will never ask you to abandon yourself in order to keep it alive. So when I finally stopped chasing, when I chose silence over explanation, stillness over reaction, and dignity over desperation, I began to uncover something that had always been within me, buried beneath layers of longing and fear and performance. I began to find a man who no longer needed to shout in order to be heard, who no longer needed to prove his worth to someone unwilling to see it, and who no longer needed to beg for closeness from someone who only offered it when convenient. This man, the one I see in the mirror today, does not live for attention, does not seek applause, and does not shrink in the presence of indifference. Instead, he stands rooted in his own values, walking forward not to impress, but simply because he refuses to remain still in a place that once drained him of every ounce of self-worth. I no longer mistake chaos for passion, nor do I confuse temporary affection with lasting commitment. I have come to understand that true power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering yourself so completely that you are no longer swayed by the ever-changing tides of someone else's desire. To the men reading this, those who feel exhausted by the weight of being overlooked, undervalued, or misunderstood, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not unworthy simply because someone else failed to recognize your depth. And you are not lost simply because the world does not applaud your quiet strength. What you are is tired. What you need is not validation. What you need is return to yourself, to your standard, to the silence that does not punish, but protects. You don't need to scream to be seen, nor do you need to beg to be loved. What you need is to stand up without asking for permission, to live with intention instead of reaction, and to embody the kind of man who commands respect not through noise, but through unwavering presence. And when you do, when you finally stop offering your worth to those who cannot hold it, something remarkable begins to happen. The ache begins to fade. Not because love has arrived to heal you, but because you've learned to love yourself so deeply that you no longer require rescue. That is the man I am today. That I am not healed because someone came back. I am healed because I stopped waiting for them to. I no longer chase. I choose, and what I choose is peace. What I choose is discipline. What I choose is a life that feels like mine again, not shaped by the hands of someone else's mood, but sculpted by my own convictions. So if you, brother, are reading this with a heavy heart and an even heavier silence, I want you to know that this journey does not end with a text from her or a moment of clarity from someone else. It ends when you remember who you were before you needed their approval to feel alive. You are not invisible. You have simply been looking for recognition in the wrong direction. Now turn inward, stand tall, and walk forward. Because when I stopped chasing her, I didn't just reclaim my dignity. I found myself. If this truth settles into your chest, the way it once did in mine, know this: you are already on the path, not the easy one, but the right one. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, because in the next chapter, we'll talk about the closure most men never receive, and the deeper power of giving it to yourself, not through rage or revenge, but through the quiet act of walking away with your soul intact. I used to believe that closure was something owed, that if someone walked away after all you gave, all you endured, all you held together in silence, they should at least come back with an apology, a confession, a final moment of truth to tie up the loose ends they left unraveling in your chest. I waited for that. I waited for the message that never came. For the late night call where she'd finally admit that she saw it, that she saw me. For the trembling voice saying, I didn't know what I had until it was gone. I even wrote out what I might say when that moment came. I rehearsed grace. I imagined strength, and still, it never happened. Because the truth is, closure doesn't come from the person who broke you. It comes from the man who decides he no longer needs them to explain why they did that. It comes in pieces, quiet ones, assembled slowly over mornings where your first thought is no longer her. Over nights where you no longer replay conversations, like puzzles waiting to be solved. Over moments where someone says her name, and your heart no longer twists in self-defense. Closure isn't delivered. It's earned. Not by her, but by you. You earn it the moment you stop wondering why she couldn't love you the way you needed. You earn it when you stop interpreting her silence as your failure. You earn it when you finally accept that some people will never give you the ending you deserve, because they were never capable of giving you the love you were ready for. There was no grand final scene for me, no tears, no mutual understanding, no last kiss at the airport. There was just a quiet morning, coffee in hand, sky still gray, and a deep, still awareness in my chest that I didn't need her story to end for mine to continue. I had written enough pages waiting for her to turn back. Now it was time to turn forward, and I know how hard that is to accept, especially when your heart still echoes with questions. When you lie awake thinking maybe if you had said less, tried more, held on longer, maybe she would have stayed. But here's the stoic truth that cuts through all of that noise. You are not responsible for the version of you she refused to see. You are not meant to be decoded like a riddle by someone who never learned to read. You're quiet, And you are not defined by what she didn't choose. You define yourself by what you chose after she left. Did you spiral? Did you chase? Did you burn? Or did you stop? Did you breathe? Did you begin again, not to prove her wrong, but to reclaim what had been forgotten? Because closure isn't about making her regret. It's about choosing not to regret loving her, even if she never knew what to do with that love. And if you've walked this far with me, if you've read every part of this journey and felt some version of yourself within these words, then hear this clearly and hold it tightly. You do not need someone else to validate your ending. You only need the strength to stop writing chapters for someone who has already closed the book. That's what Stoicism taught me, not to harden, but to anchor. Not to numb out, but to feel deeply without becoming consumed. Not to avoid love, but to never again abandon myself for it. I no longer wait for closure. I create it with every boundary I honor, with every moment I choose peace over provocation, with every step I take in the direction of becoming the man I was too distracted to be while chasing someone else's affection. And when I look back now, I don't see failure. I see fire. A fire that burned away the illusions I once clung to. The illusion that love without respect is still worth it. The illusion that being chosen means you are seen. The illusion that her return would fix what her absence had shattered. It didn't, but I did. So if you're still waiting for the final word, the apology, the closure that never seems to come, let this be your moment to choose something greater. Not revenge, not reaction, but release. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, because this isn't just the end of her chapter in your story. This is the beginning of the one where you stop chasing and start leading. Now walk. Not to prove anything, not to show her what she lost, but because you finally remember what it feels like to come home to yourself.